The empaths of old feared this mirror above all others, for it would show them the one person they'd spent lifetimes avoiding, themselves. Tonight, we speak of why that mirror still calls from the shadows, and why your soul aches with the memory of what it might reveal. The taste of that ancient fear still lingers on your tongue, metallic like touching iron in winter. Can you feel it? The weight of invisible wounds. She sat in the corner of the coffee shop, absorbing the anxiety of strangers like a sponge left too long in murky water. The businessman's divorce, a sharp taste of copper beneath her tongue, the mother's exhaustion, a weight pressing against her sternum like cold stone, the teenager's silent scream, a high-pitched ringing that only she could hear, vibrating through her bones. All of it lived inside her chest, heavy and unnamed, while her own authentic anguish grew silent as snow falling on wool. But when someone asked, "How are you feeling?" she froze. The question felt foreign, almost violent in its directness, like being asked to describe the color of air or the sound of her own heartbeat when she'd forgotten how to listen. This is the empath's first wound, carrying pain that didn't originate in their own story, while their authentic anguish remains buried beneath layers of inherited emotion. Jung called it the wounded healer archetype, those who instinctively tend to others' shadows, while their own inner landscape grows barren from neglect. The neural pathways of the empathic brain light up like Christmas trees when encountering others' distress. Mirror neurons fire relentlessly, creating what neuroscientist Marco Iacoboni describes as emotional contagion, the involuntary absorption of surrounding feelings. But here lies the paradox. This same brain often goes silent when asked to identify its own emotional truth, the mirror that reflects absence. Maria, a therapist I once knew, described her recurring dream with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. She stood before an ornate mirror whose surface felt cold as winter glass against her fingertips. Everyone appeared in that reflection. Clients weeping, family members laughing, strangers from the street pleading, their voices creating a symphony of muffled cries, as if heard through water. But where her reflection should have been, there was only empty space shaped like a woman, an absence that tasted of forgotten words and unshed tears. This dream speaks to the empath's deepest terror, not that they feel too much, but that beneath all the borrowed emotions, they may discover they feel nothing at all. The mirror they avoid isn't one that would show them pain. It's one that might reveal the hollow echo where their authentic self should reside, the silence that sounds like wind through empty rooms. Why this hurts at a soul level? The empath's suffering doesn't stem from their capacity to feel. It emerges from their disconnection from their own feeling center. When we absorb without boundaries, we become like ancient vessels cracked by overuse, holding everyone's water but unable to contain our own. This isn't sensitivity, it's a spiritual emergency disguised as a gift. The soul of the empath cries out not to feel less, but to feel themselves more clearly, to distinguish between the pain that teaches and the pain that merely drowns them in borrowed sorrow. If these words are stirring something ancient within you, something that tastes like recognition mixed with longing, then perhaps your soul is ready to remember what it came here to reclaim. Consider staying with us on this journey. There are others walking this path of return, and sometimes the most healing thing is knowing you're not walking it alone. There's an old Celtic myth about a woman who could heal any wound by taking it into her own body. Village after village sought her out, and she absorbed their ailments with grace and power. But one morning she woke up and couldn't remember who she had been before the first wound entered her. The healer had become a ghost of accumulated pain, the archetypal trap of the wounded healer. Modern empaths live this myth daily. Dr. Stephen Porges' discoveries about the body's nervous pathways reveal how the empath's internal alarm system develops hyperactive social scanning responses, constantly reading environments for emotional distress to regulate, like a lighthouse that never stops rotating, never stops searching for ships in distress. This creates what I call empathic hypervigilance, a state where the soul never rests because it's perpetually on duty as an emotional paramedic. The wounded healer archetype, explored deeply by Jungian analyst Alice Miller, shows us how those who experienced early emotional neglect often develop extraordinary sensitivity to others' needs while remaining blind to their own. The child who learned that love came through caretaking grows into an adult whose identity depends on being needed, wanted, useful to others' healing. But here's what most miss. This isn't natural empathy. It's trauma adaptation, masquerading as spiritual gift. The nervous system molds to others' trauma. Consider James, who grew up with a depressed mother. By age 6, he could read her mood from the sound of her footsteps. He learned to modulate his own energy to match hers, becoming smaller when she was fragile, more animated when she needed cheering. His nervous system literally rewired itself around her emotional states. Decades later, James enters every room performing this same unconscious dance. His vagus nerve, the primary pathway of the parasympathetic nervous system, has been conditioned to prioritize others' regulation over his own. What feels like deep empathy is actually a survival strategy gone unchecked. Neuroscientist Dr. Daniel Siegel's research reveals that when we consistently prioritize external emotional cues over internal ones, the part of the brain that whispers, "This is who you are when you're alone," that inner compass of self-recognition, literally begins to fade. The empath doesn't just feel others deeply, they lose the neural pathways that lead back to their own emotional homeland. Fusion trauma, when feeling everything becomes avoidance. The most profound insight about empathic absorption came to me through a client named Sarah. She described feeling emotionally pregnant with everyone's pain, carrying grief that wasn't hers, anger that had no personal origin. During our work together, she uncovered a devastating truth. All this feeling of others had become her strategy to avoid feeling the massive emptiness inside herself. This is fusion trauma, when the boundaries between self and other become so permeable that we lose track of where we end and others begin. Psychologist Dr. Pia Melody describes this as emotional enmeshment, where the individual's emotional reality becomes completely entangled with their environment. The empath who feels everything is often the empath who cannot bear to feel their own authentic emotional truth, that they're lonely, angry, disappointed, or simply sad. The constant absorption becomes a sophisticated form of emotional bypassing, using others' feelings to avoid the terrifying work of sitting with their own. There's a woman who comes to me in dreams sometimes. She sits in a room full of mirrors, each one reflecting a different person's face. Her lovers, her children, her friends, all staring back at her from every angle. She reaches toward the mirrors, desperate to find herself among them, but every reflection shows only who she becomes in relation to others. In the center of the room, where her true reflection should be, there's only a window looking out into endless night. The broken mirror, reflecting everyone but your center. The depth psychology of empathic identity loss reveals something profound. We don't just absorb others' emotions, we absorb their sense of self. Dr. James Masterson's work on the false self shows how individuals with weak identity boundaries literally borrow selfhood from those around them, becoming chameleons of consciousness. I once worked with David, a musician who could feel the creative energy of every artist he encountered. In recording studios, he'd unconsciously mirror the aesthetic preferences of producers. With jazz musicians, he'd feel pulled toward improvisation. Around classical performers, his playing became precise and structured. The gift seemed remarkable until he realized he'd never discovered his own musical voice. This isn't artistic versatility, it's identity fragmentation. The empath's sense of self becomes so fluid that it loses all cohesion. They become like water, taking the shape of whatever container holds them, with no memory of their original form. The confusion between connection and self-erasure. Contemporary culture has romanticized this loss of boundaries as deep connection or spiritual sensitivity. But true spiritual teachers throughout history have warned against this confusion. The 13th century mystic Meister Eckhart wrote, "The soul that would touch God must first know where she herself begins." The empath often mistakes self-erasure for love, boundary dissolution for intimacy, emotional fusion for deep connection. But genuine connection requires two complete beings choosing to bridge the space between them, not one person disappearing into the other's reality. Psychologist Dr. Harriet Lerner's research on overfunctioning in relationships shows how empaths often become so attuned to others' needs that they lose track of their own desires, preferences, and authentic responses. They become expert at reading rooms, but strangers to their own hearts. The absence of psychic boundaries as soul exhaustion. The most devastating consequence of empathic boundary loss isn't the pain they absorb, It's the chronic exhaustion that comes from having no psychic home to return to. Dr. Judith Orloff's work on energy vampires misses this crucial point. The problem isn't that others drain empaths, it's that empaths have no energetic center to draw from. Consider Elena, who described feeling like an emotional refugee in her own life. Every social interaction left her depleted, not because others took from her, but because she had no stable identity to metabolize the experience. She was like a tree with no roots, constantly blown about by every wind while slowly dying from lack of nourishment. This rootlessness manifests somatically as well. Empaths often experience chronic fatigue, autoimmune disorders, and nervous system dysregulation, the body's way of signaling that the psyche has lost its way home. The tragedy isn't that empaths feel too much, it's that they've forgotten how to feel themselves. They become hollow vessels, capable of holding everyone's water but unable to recognize their own thirst. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, there grows a plant called the sensitive plant. Touch its leaves and they instantly fold inward, recoiling from contact. Botanists discovered that this plant's nervous system is so reactive that it responds not just to physical touch, but to vibrations, changes in light, even the emotional states of nearby organisms. The empath's nervous system has evolved into something similar, a hyperactive radar system that never stops scanning, never stops responding, never stops recoiling. The cortisol of empathic guilt. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's groundbreaking research on stress hormones reveals something crucial about empathic overwhelm. It's not just about feeling others' emotions, it's about the chronic guilt cascade that follows. When an empath absorbs someone's pain and cannot fix it, their cortisol levels spike in patterns identical to those found in trauma survivors. This creates what I call empathic guilt syndrome, a chronic state where the nervous system interprets others' suffering as personal failure. The empath's adrenal glands work overtime, pumping stress hormones in response to pain they cannot control, creating a feedback loop of exhaustion and hypervigilance. Maria shared with me how she'd wake at 3 a.m. with her heart racing, replaying conversations from days before, wondering if she'd said enough, given enough, been present enough for others' pain. Her body was literally attacking itself with guilt chemicals, creating a state of chronic inflammation that manifested as joint pain, digestive issues, and insomnia. The alert mode prison, polyvagal theory and belonging trauma. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory illuminates why empaths live in perpetual alert mode. The vagus nerve, our body's primary relaxation pathway, becomes dysregulated in individuals who experienced early belonging trauma, the childhood wound of learning that love is conditional on meeting others' emotional needs. The empath's nervous system gets stuck in what researchers call sympathetic dominance, a state where the body believes it's constantly under siege. But the threat isn't physical violence, it's emotional abandonment. The system remains hypervigilant, scanning for any sign that others are in distress, because deep down, the empath's survival instincts believe that others' happiness equals their own continued existence. This isn't metaphorical, it's measurably physiological. When researchers monitor the empath's heart rhythm, they discover something profound. Even during supposedly restful states, their internal drumbeat remains erratic, anxious, never fully settling into the slow, deep rhythm of true peace. Their bodies literally cannot relax because they're always on duty for others' emotional regulation. Serotonin and the biochemistry of self-abandonment. Recent discoveries about brain chemistry reveal something profound about empathic depression. Empaths often have paradoxical patterns in their brain's happiness circuits, flooding with feel-good chemicals when helping others, but crashing into dangerous lows during solitude, as if their neural networks forget how to create joy without an audience of need. This creates a biochemical addiction to caretaking. The empath's brain only produces feel-good chemicals when tending to others, while solitude triggers serotonin crashes that feel like emotional death. They become chemically dependent on others' needs to maintain basic neurological stability. James described this phenomenon perfectly. When I'm alone, I feel like I'm dying, not metaphorically dying, actually dying, like my brain forgets how to make happiness unless someone else needs me. His brain had literally rewired itself to equate self-worth with service, creating a neurochemical prison where solitude became unbearable. The empath's body becomes a hyperactive radar that never stops searching for signals to interpret, pain to absorb, needs to meet. But this radar has lost the ability to detect the most important signal of all, the quiet voice of their own soul, calling them home to themselves. In the old traditions, they said some children are born remembering, not past lives or mystical visions, but the unspoken sorrows of their lineage, ancestral pain that flows through bloodlines like underground rivers, surfacing in the most sensitive souls of each generation. The empath often carries this inheritance without knowing it, feeling emotions that predate their own story, absorbing grief that began before their first breath. The family unconscious as a fogged mirror. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious finds its most intimate expression in what family therapists call transgenerational trauma, the passage of unprocessed emotional material through family systems. For empaths, this inheritance isn't just psychological, it's somatically embodied, neurologically integrated, spiritually woven into their very being. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's groundbreaking research revealed that trauma literally rewrites the body's instruction manual, altering the genetic messages passed to children and grandchildren who never experienced the original wounds. The empath's hypersensitivity often represents this ancestral wisdom, a nervous system calibrated to detect dangers that their ancestors faced, like a smoke detector still sounding alarms for fires that burned out generations ago. But here's what most miss. The empath doesn't just inherit trauma responses, they inherit the family's unprocessed emotions. The grandmother's ungrieved losses, the grandfather's unexpressed rage, the mother's unfelt disappointment, all of it becomes part of the empath's emotional DNA. Consider Anna, who experienced waves of inexplicable sadness every autumn. Through family constellation work, she discovered that her great-grandmother had lost 3 children during a brutal winter in rural Mexico. The seasonal depression wasn't Anna's. It was her great-grandmother's grief, passed down through 4 generations of women who never had space to fully mourn. When the soul carries generations to be seen, the empath's archetypal role within family systems often becomes that of the family feelinger, the one who carries everyone's unexpressed emotions so the system can maintain its appearance of stability. Family therapist Virginia Satir identified this as the super-responsible child who becomes the emotional thermostat for the entire clan. This isn't conscious choice. It's soul contract. The empath spirit seems to recognize that certain emotional truths must be held, honored, and eventually transformed. They become what theologian Matthew Fox calls cosmic emptiers, those who hollow themselves out to hold the pain that others cannot bear. But this sacred role becomes distorted when the empath mistakes carrying for healing, absorption for transformation. They become like ancient burial grounds, holding the dead without knowing how to help them rest. The archetypal mission, transmutation without absorption. Indigenous traditions worldwide recognize certain individuals as bridge walkers, those who can move between the world of the living and the realm of ancestral pain, facilitating healing across generations. But these traditions also teach crucial boundaries. The bridge walker learns to facilitate without absorbing, to witness without becoming. The empath's true spiritual work isn't to carry ancestral pain indefinitely. It's to create space for its conscious expression and eventual release. This requires what shamanic practitioners call right relationship with inherited suffering, honoring it without drowning in it, witnessing it without becoming it. Dr. Thomas Hübel's work on collective trauma healing shows how empaths can become coherent channels for ancestral processing, allowing the pain to move through them without taking residence. This requires immense spiritual maturity and precise energetic boundaries. The empath stands at the crossroads between past and future, carrying forward the emotional intelligence that previous generations couldn't access. But their deepest healing comes when they stop carrying the pain and start midwifing its transformation, becoming not collectors of ancestral wounds, but alchemists of generational healing. There's a story told in therapeutic circles about a child who learned to hold her breath underwater for impossible lengths of time, not because she loved swimming, but because she discovered that when she was submerged in silence, her mother stopped crying. The child's body adapted to oxygen deprivation as a form of love, learning to suffocate herself to preserve the peace. This is the empath's first training: how to disappear without dying, how to silence without ceasing to exist. Repression as love preservation. Dr. Alice Miller's work on gifted children reveals the profound psychological bind that creates empathic hypervigilance, the realization that their authentic emotional expression threatens the stability of those they need most. The sensitive child learns that their own intensity, their anger, their sadness, their exuberant joy, destabilizes the adults around them. This creates what psychologist Dr. Jonas Webb calls emotional neglect, not the absence of care, but the absence of permission to feel. The empathic child receives subtle but persistent messages. Your emotions are too much, your needs are inconvenient, your authentic self is dangerous to others' well-being. So they make an unconscious pact with silence. They learn to compress their emotional reality into digestible portions, to modulate their intensity for others' comfort, to become emotional minimalists in service of relational stability. Michael, a client of mine, described this perfectly. I learned that love meant making myself smaller. Every time I expressed genuine feeling, excitement, disappointment, fear, I saw my mother's nervous system spike. So I became an expert at partial truth, giving just enough authenticity to seem real without enough intensity to overwhelm. The symbolic fear of existing in full intensity. The empath's deepest terror isn't that others will reject them, it's that their full authentic presence will somehow damage the people they love. This creates what Dr. Stephen Cartman calls rescue fantasy, the unconscious belief that they must manage others' emotional states to prevent catastrophe. This fear has archetypal dimensions. In fairy tales, the most sensitive characters often possess dangerous gifts, touch that kills, voices that shatter glass, emotions that flood kingdoms. The empath internalizes this mythic warning. Your true nature is beautiful but destructive, powerful but dangerous, sacred but unsafe for ordinary human contact. The sensitive child's survival strategy. Developmental trauma research shows how children with empathic temperaments develop what Dr. Pete Walker calls emotional perfectionism, the compulsive need to monitor and modulate their authentic responses to maintain attachment security. They become like emotional contortionists, twisting their natural responses into shapes that won't threaten others' stability. This survival strategy works brilliantly in childhood, but becomes a prison in adulthood. The empath develops extraordinary emotional intelligence about others, while remaining strangers to their own authentic feeling states. They can read a room with telepathic accuracy, but cannot identify their own preferences, desires, or boundaries. Sarah shared how she realized at age 35 that she'd never allowed herself to be genuinely angry. Not because she wasn't angry, she was furious about dozens of lifetime disappointments, but because her child self had learned that her anger made others afraid, guilty, defensive. So she'd spent decades transmuting rage into understanding, disappointment into compassion, betrayal into forgiveness, each transformation leaving the taste of copper in her mouth, the sensation of swallowing fire until her throat forgot how to scream. The empathic pact with silence isn't noble self-sacrifice, it's trauma adaptation that echoes through generations. The scream they swallow isn't just sound, it's the voice of their authentic soul, waiting in the dark for permission to finally speak its truth, to let its raw sound fill the spaces that have been hollow for too long. Perhaps as you listen to this, you're feeling that familiar tightness in your throat, the place where your own unspoken truths have gathered like stones. If this resonates in your bones, in that deep place where recognition lives, then you understand why this work matters. Others are awakening to these same truths, and there's profound healing in witnessing this awakening together. In medieval manuscripts, there are illustrations of angels bound in golden chains, not imprisoned by demons, but trapped by their own unwillingness to acknowledge anything but perfect light. These angels waste away, their wings atrophying from disuse, their halos dimming from the effort of maintaining perpetual radiance. The empathic spiritual seeker often becomes such an angel, imprisoned not by darkness but by the tyranny of forced luminosity, the trap of always being light. The contemporary spiritual community has created what Dr. John Welwood calls spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid psychological and emotional realities. For empaths, this often manifests as light addiction, the compulsive need to transform all shadow into illumination, all darkness into inspiration, all anger into love. This creates a particularly insidious form of spiritual imprisonment. The empath learns to wear their sensitivity like a halo, defining themselves as healers, lightworkers, or love beings who exist to transmute others' darkness. But this identity becomes a cage that prevents them from accessing their own authentic emotional range. Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes warns against what she calls the too-good woman syndrome, the psychological pattern where individuals, particularly women, become so identified with nurturing and healing that they lose access to their natural capacity for healthy aggression, boundary setting, and self-protection. Why empathy without shadow breeds burnout? Carl Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, requires integration of both light and shadow aspects of the psyche. When empaths reject their own darkness, they become what he called pseudo-spiritual, performing enlightenment while remaining unconscious of their own complexity. This creates profound psychological splitting. The empath's rejected anger doesn't disappear. It goes underground, manifesting as passive aggression, chronic resentment, or somatic illness. Their unacknowledged selfishness doesn't vanish. It emerges as martyrdom, manipulation, or emotional manipulation disguised as care. Lisa, a yoga teacher and self-proclaimed empath healer, came to therapy experiencing chronic fatigue and mysterious autoimmune symptoms. Through her work, she discovered that her body was literally attacking itself because she'd spent years forcing herself to feel only love, gratitude, and compassion while suppressing rage, disappointment, and grief. Her immune system had become the voice of her disowned shadow, creating inflammation as the only way her psyche could express the anger she'd spiritually bypassed for decades. Reclaiming the wounded angel archetype. The path forward for empaths isn't to abandon their sensitivity, but to humanize it. This requires what psychologist Dr. Marion Woodman calls embodied spirituality, a spirituality that includes the full spectrum of human experience rather than transcending it. The wounded angel must come down from the ethereal realms and plant feet firmly on earth. This means acknowledging that empaths can be selfish, manipulative, controlling, and resentful, not despite their sensitivity, but sometimes because of it. True empathic healing happens when they stop trying to be enlightened beings and start becoming complete humans. This includes developing what Dr. Harriet Lerner calls the capacity for clean anger, the ability to express authentic fury without shame or the need to immediately transform it into something prettier. The empath's greatest spiritual achievement isn't becoming pure light, it's becoming whole. This wholeness includes their capacity for fierce protection, clear boundaries, righteous anger, and selective compassion. They learn that saying no can be as sacred as saying yes, that healthy selfishness serves love better than compulsive self-sacrifice. The false light must dim for the true light to emerge, not the artificial illumination of spiritual performance, but the authentic radiance that comes from loving themselves enough to be real. There's an ancient practice among desert mystics called mirror gazing, not the narcissistic admiration of physical beauty, but the courageous act of looking into one's own eyes until the false self dissolves and something truer emerges. The empath who has spent lifetimes reading others' faces must eventually turn toward the most terrifying mirror of all, the one that reflects their own undisguised soul. The symbolic practice of seeing oneself, without filters, Jung's technique of active imagination, provides a roadmap for empaths to reclaim their inner landscape. Instead of constantly interpreting others' symbols, dreams, and emotional states, they must learn to dialogue with their own unconscious material. This requires what he called holding the tension of opposites, the ability to contain contradictory feelings without immediately resolving them into comfortable spiritual explanations. Dr. James Hillman's archetypal psychology offers empaths a powerful tool, learning to see their own life through mythic lenses. Instead of constantly analyzing others' patterns, they begin to recognize their own archetypal themes, the recurring symbols, relationships, and scenarios that reveal their soul's deeper intentions. One of my clients, David, spent years interpreting everyone else's dreams and emotional patterns with remarkable accuracy. But when I asked him to track his own dream symbols, he discovered he'd been having the same dream for 20 years, standing in an art gallery full of empty frames. Through active imagination work, he realized these frames represented all the space he'd given to others' stories, while leaving no room for his own authentic expression. the body as mirror of reconnection. Somatic therapy recognizes that empaths often experience what Dr. Peter Levine calls trauma of accommodation, chronic nervous system dysregulation from constantly adapting to others' emotional states. The healing path requires learning to use the body as an internal compass rather than an external antenna. This means developing what trauma therapists call inner sensing, the body's ability to distinguish between internal and external emotional weather. Empaths must learn to ask, is this storm brewing in my own sky, or am I feeling the rain from someone else's clouds? This isn't intellectual analysis, it's bodily wisdom, the kind that knows the difference between your heartbeat and an echo. The practice begins with simple somatic check-ins throughout the day. Before entering social situations, the empath learns to notice their baseline energy. After interactions, they practice differentiating their authentic responses from absorbed emotions. Over time, the body becomes a reliable mirror for emotional authenticity. Rituals of self-listening. Traditional cultures understood that sensitive individuals needed specific practices to maintain psychic boundaries. The empath's healing requires creating personal rituals that honor their inner world with the same attention they've given to others. This might include morning practices of emotional inventory, not to fix or change feelings, but simply to witness and acknowledge their presence. Evening rituals of energetic clearing, returning absorbed emotions to their origins while reclaiming authentic personal energy. Some empaths benefit from what I call mirror journaling, writing dialogues between different aspects of themselves, giving voice to the parts that have been silenced by their caretaking role. Others find healing through creative expression that has no audience, no purpose except pure self-expression. The key is consistency and sacred attention. The empath must learn to give themselves the quality of presence they've always offered others, patient, non-judgmental, deeply curious about what wants to emerge. Rebuilding identity, free from external noise. The ultimate healing for empaths isn't learning to feel less or protect themselves more. It's discovering who they are when they're not defined by others' needs. This requires what psychologist Dr. Marsha Linehan calls radical acceptance of their authentic preferences, desires, and boundaries. This process often reveals that the empath's authentic self is quite different from their caretaking persona. They might discover they're more introverted than they thought, more creative than they expressed, more boundaried than they allowed themselves to be. The true mirror reflects not just wounds and shadows, but also gifts and potentials that have been dormant while focusing on others. The empath who learns to see themselves clearly often discovers artistic abilities, leadership qualities, or innovative insights that were impossible to access while their attention was constantly directed outward. This inner reflection doesn't eliminate their empathic gifts. It grounds them in authentic selfhood, making their sensitivity a conscious choice rather than a compulsive pattern. They become empaths by choice rather than empaths by default. The woman in my dreams sits before that room of mirrors one last time, but something has changed. The reflections are still there, her lovers, her children, her friends staring back from every surface. But now, in the center of the room, where once there was only a window looking into endless night, she sees her own face. Not pretty or perfect, not free from pain or shadow, but undeniably, authentically hers. She reaches toward this reflection, and for the first time, it reaches back. The persistence of empathic pain. The truth that most spiritual teachings avoid. Empathic healing doesn't eliminate the pain. It transforms the empath's relationship to pain itself. The hurt persists because there are aspects of their authentic self still waiting to be acknowledged, integrated, honored. Dr. Rumi's 13th century poem, The Guest House, captures this perfectly. Welcome and entertain them all. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. The empath's remaining pain points toward the parts of themselves that have been exiled, rejected, or spiritually bypassed. This pain is not pathology. It's sacred messenger. Each unresolved hurt carries information about boundaries that need strengthening, truths that need speaking, or aspects of authenticity that require integration. When inner fragments remain unheard, family systems therapy recognizes that we all contain internal families, different aspects of self that hold various emotional experiences, memories, and survival strategies. The empath often has numerous internal parts that have been silenced by their caretaking role. The angry child who wasn't allowed to protest, the selfish teenager who learned to hide their desires, the ambitious adult who sublimated their dreams to serve others. These unheard aspects don't disappear. They create internal tension, somatic symptoms, and persistent emotional pain until they're acknowledged and integrated. The empath's healing requires what Dr. Richard Schwartz calls internal family systems work, learning to dialogue with these exiled parts with the same compassion they've shown others. The mirror that reveals both shadow and light. The final mirror the empath must face reflects their complete emotional spectrum, not just their capacity for love and healing, but their capacity for anger, selfishness, ambition, and desire. This completeness isn't spiritual failure, it's spiritual maturity. When empaths stop trying to be spiritual archetypes and start being complete humans, their empathic gifts become grounded in authentic selfhood. They can feel others deeply because they feel themselves clearly. They can offer genuine compassion because they've learned to extend compassion to their own complexity. Healing. When empathy includes the self, the revolution happens when empaths apply their exquisite sensitivity to their own inner landscape with the same dedication they've offered others. When they become as curious about their own dreams as they've been about others' stories. When they defend their own boundaries as fiercely as they've protected others' feelings. This isn't narcissism, it's integration. The empath who includes themselves in the circle of care becomes a healer not from depletion, but from overflow. They serve not from obligation, but from authentic choice. The mirror they feared most, the one that reflects their unadorned truth, becomes the gateway to freedom. In seeing themselves clearly, without the filters of others' needs or expectations, they discover that their authentic self was never the problem. The problem was the prison of partial identity, the cage of borrowed pain, the exile from their own emotional homeland. The hurt remains, but it transforms from suffering into sacred information, from wound into wisdom, from pain that diminishes into pain that guides them home to themselves. In the end, the empath's greatest healing isn't learning to feel others less intensely, it's learning to feel themselves completely. The mirror they avoided reveals not emptiness, but presence, not absence, but the face of their own soul, finally ready to be seen. The path of the authentic empath isn't about choosing between self and others. It's about becoming so whole that service flows from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion, from love that includes the self rather than love that erases it. If this reflection has stirred something in your own depths, honor that stirring. It may be your soul's way of calling you back to the mirror you've been avoiding, the one that shows not who you are in relation to others, but who you are in the sacred solitude of your own becoming.